Greetings. In the last lecture, I distinguished civil liberties from civil rights using the terms negative and positive freedoms. I mentioned also that slavery was really the great silence of the Constitution, that slavery was not just an economic instrument, but that both Northern and Southern interests tried to use the slaves as pawns to push their political agenda and increase their political representation in the House of Representatives, as well as in the Electoral College, and that slavery was essentially left for history to decide. And when the Supreme Court dealt the Missouri Compromise really a mortal blow by declaring it unconstitutional, many historians believe that the decision in the Dred Scott case made the Civil War inevitable. I don't believe that it personally made the Civil War inevitable, although there is no question that the decision in the Dred Scott made the Civil War much more likely. It seemed to justify the Southern view of the Constitution, that the states had created the Union and therefore they could dissolve it, that the states were the primary partners in federalism. Certainly that was not the Northern view. The vast majority of Northerners believed that the Constitution was created by the people. It therefore was indissoluble. And there were a lot of criticisms of Justice Taney because the decision by the Supreme Court in Dred Scott versus Sanford, this was the first time in American history that a major congressional law was struck down by the Supreme Court. And so the deadliest conflict on our planet, the U.S. Civil War, more Americans died in the Civil War than any other war that the United States has been involved in. It was the deadliest war, as I mentioned, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 until the beginning of World War I in 1914. And there were obviously lots of significant aspects that came out of this Civil War. One was obviously that the Northern view of the Constitution held, that we were a nation bound together as people, and therefore the Constitution was indissoluble. But the aftermath of the Civil War also resulted in three major constitutional changes that I referred to at the end of the lecture. The simplest, the most straightforward of the three amendments was the 13th Amendment that prohibited slavery. So certainly, if we consider slavery the great silence of the Constitution, with the adoption of the 13th Amendment, the Constitution is no longer silent about slavery. There is no future for slavery. The 14th Amendment, as I mentioned in the last lecture, was much more complex. It had a civil liberties component, the Due Process Clause. The most significant provision for civil rights was the granting of former slave citizenship. And I mentioned earlier when I talked about constitutional amendments that people do not believe that there are checks and balances on the Supreme Court, and I mentioned there are several of them. The Supreme Court can have its size changed by Congress, which occurred many times before 1869, but has not occurred since. The ultimate check on a Supreme Court decision is to change the Constitution itself. So Justice Taney ruled that former slaves aren't citizens. Well, the 14th Amendment says that former slaves are in fact citizens, and that overturned the Dred Scott case. The 15th Amendment is intriguing to me, not just as a political scientist, but to me personally. Right? The 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. And before the Civil War, many early feminists gained valuable political experience fighting slavery. The primary reason that these ladies fought slavery was because slavery was an immoral and repugnant institution. But these ladies also made the assumption that there was something in it for them, that if black men were given the right to vote, then they would also get the right to vote. And certainly this makes sense. If the men who love you and you love in return, your father, your son, your brother, your husband, if these men are going to give the right to vote to black men who are strangers that they don't even know, why wouldn't they give the right to vote to the women in their lives that they love? Well, of course, that didn't happen. And as I've mentioned several times when we were meeting face to face, what these early feminists did not realize is that the men in their lives were far, far, far more sexist than racist. And I believe that this is true. The older I get, the more convinced I am that this is true. And the older I get, the wider I believe that gap to be. And so we do not see a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote nationwide until 1920, 50 years later. The 15th Amendment, and I'll talk about this in more detail later, but drove a wedge in the women's movement. One group continued to lobby Congress, and of course that didn't go anywhere for decades. Another group of women decided that we are not going to make any progress at the national level. And so these women, who I believe were very pragmatic, went out state by state trying to get the right to vote. I'll go into a lot more detail about this later on, but one of the advantages, remember, of federalism is that it allows diversity. So women were able to go out and get the right to vote in several Western states before the passage of the 19th Amendment. So Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote. It spread to Colorado, to Idaho, to Utah, to Washington, and then California was the sixth state to give women the right to vote. And by 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, it really did not impact Western women at all. Every Western state except New Mexico already gave women the right to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment. But many women, especially in southern states, did not have the right to vote, and that obviously changed their life in a fundamentally positive way. So the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, in that legacy of slavery. But now we run into perhaps just as evil a system. This second legacy, the legacy of slavery. You see, it was nice that slavery was abolished. It was nice that these former slaves were given citizenship, and at least constitutionally, black men were given the right to vote. But keep in mind, this did not change the economic and social realities for these former slaves. These former slaves had no more education after the war than they did before. They had no more money at the end of the war than they had before. They had no more land at the end of the war than they did before the war. And the tragic result of this and a variety of other factors is that white Southerners imposed another evil system, what's often called the era of Jim Crow, or legal segregation throughout the South. Now, before I get into the era of Jim Crow, and I will do that in the next mini lecture, I do want to briefly discuss the two types of segregation that I have listed in your notes. The first is de jure segregation. This is the segregation that I'm going to talk about in several lectures to come. This is segregation that is legally mandated or required by law. This was the type of segregation that I referred to in the federalism section when I brought up for the first time the landmark 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1954, when that case went to the Supreme Court, 17 states mandated, they legally required that their schools would be segregated by law. There were 4 other states that gave local school districts the options as to whether to segregate or not. So during the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the most segregated school children in America were black school children. Today, there still is significant segregation in America. We call this segregation de facto segregation. De facto segregation is segregation that results from non-legal factors, things like economic inequalities, racial attitudes, or the settlement patterns of people. And this type of segregation is far more difficult to deal with than de jure segregation. If you have segregation that results from the law, then the way that you get rid of that segregation is to change the law. However, economic inequalities, people's attitudes, or settlement patterns of people are far more resistant to a legal remedy. For example, think back to when I told you about my grandfather back in Kentucky. My grandpa Randall, unfortunately, was a racist. When the city of Louisville downtown became integrated during the Depression, and then most notably in World War II, when there was a large influx of black Americans to go work in factories in the West and in the North, my grandpa made my grandma, and my grandma's family had lived in Louisville since the War of 1812. They had been there. They were amongst the pioneering families from Louisville. They had been there for a long, long time, 100 years when she was born in 1913. She did not want to leave, and yet she obeyed Grandpa and moved. And whenever I would visit her, she would want to go downtown and visit. And so the reason they moved had to do with my grandfather's attitude, which unfortunately never changed his whole life. And so this de facto segregation means that there are large segments of American society that are still segregated. Not because the law mandates it, but because A, various groups earn differing amounts of money. Keep in mind that statistic from Greenberg and Page. 24% of black Americans live in poverty. 21% of Hispanic Americans live in poverty. 9% of white Americans live in poverty. And therefore, you, in many communities, have people segregated largely by race because of economic inequalities and settlement patterns. So if you look at schools today in America in 2020, the most segregated school children in America in 2020 are no longer black school children. They're Hispanic school children. And so the type of segregation has moved from legal to non-legal, and different groups have been impacted. There is still is tremendous segregation in cities north and south, east and west, and this de facto I'll mention a little bit later, but it isn't going to be my main topic of conversation. Instead, I want to just give you a teaser to where the next lecture is going to start with this era of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a racist character in a popular 19th century minstrel show. And the purpose of Jim Crow laws were to establish wholesale segregation of the South. There were thousands of Jim Crow laws. Some of them today seem laughable. For example, my favorite Jim Crow law that makes me laugh today is that the state of Louisiana mandated segregated blind schools. Now, you would think of any group of people where race and skin color wouldn't matter, it would be blind people. But that was a law in the books. North Carolina mandated segregated textbooks. The textbooks, for example, if you had math textbooks that started with a black student, the math book had to stay with black students. Or if it started with a white student, it'd have to stay with white students. Again, an absurd sounding law.